Hello, everyone. My name is Tianyao. I'm a PhD student from Purdue University. Today, I'm going to talk about our most recent research on computing's biodiversity impact. So, first of all, we all have seen more or less the biodiversity loss, like these scary photos show the water blue, acid rain, and loss of forest and aquatic trash. But what we may not know is that computing can actually be part of the reason for biodiversity loss. Computing's life cycle actually generates direct environmental stressors in a lot of ways. For example, this is the ecosystem, and chip fabrication releases air and water pollutants, including acid gas and heavy metal ion. Another path is the data center power, which uses fossil fuel generated electricity, and this indirectly drives the acidification process. Last but not least, when the electronic waste reaches their end of life, it goes into the leachate pond and leaches heavy metals into the ecosystem. So since computing has so much to do with biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss is such a severe problem, why has no one explored it? The answer is that there exists two major research barriers. The first is the matrix barrier, which means there is no quantifiable way to attribute the biodiversity loss to specific computing activities. The second is the modeling barrier, which means there is no modeling framework to connect the workload and system to a concrete impact number across the life cycle. To address these challenges, we conduct the first analysis of biodiversity impact in computing. In response to the research barrier, matrix barrier, we introduced two new metrics, EBI and OBI, to quantify the impact. In response to the modeling barrier, we present Fabric, the first modeling framework that connects the life cycle impact to computing workloads. Finally, we use these tools to evaluate the impact across different devices, systems, workloads, and geographic deployment. In this slide, we first highlight our study scope. We use standard lifecycle analysis method and focuses on three types of major midpoint impact, which quantify the direct environmental pressures induced by the toxic substances released into the environment. This includes the acidification process, which means how much emitted gases can lower the environmental pH, and the eutrophication process, which means how excess nitrogen and phosphorus can enrich the ecosystems, and freshwater ecotoxicity, which quantifies the toxic impact of chemicals released into the freshwater ecosystems. We select these three midpoints because sustainability reports from key vendors like TSMC and SK Hynix disclose the necessary emission data that directly map into these impacts. And to aggregate and unify these midpoint impacts, we use the Recipe 2016 model to convert midpoint impact into a single unified biodiversity metric expressed in species year, which quantifies the expected fraction of species locally lost per year due to the cumulative environmental stressors. Using these tools, we build our Fabric framework, which means fabrication to grave biodiversity impact calculation. This means we are ignoring the upstream mining and material refinement process due to the fragmented and opaque supply chain that limit the precise impact tracking. And the right part of the flowchart is the midpoints and endpoints described above, and we shall focus on the middle part to introduce our novel metrics, EBI and OBI. So EBI is embodied biodiversity impacts, which quantifies the one-time impact of hardware's physical life cycle and covers manufacturing, transportation, and end-of-life stages. As for OBI, it is operational biodiversity impacts and it focuses on the ongoing impact of electricity use in the operational state. Now, let's take a closer look into these two new metrics. So in EBI, we identify two kinds of different environmental damage that is related. The first is the directly releasing toxic substances into the environment, like the chip flash releases the acid gas and heavy metal ion. The second is indirectly causing emissions by driving fossil fuel use, which is the bottom part in this figure. The EBI of this device is calculated by summing all these impacts across different life cycle stages and impact categories. And just like embodied carbon, the EBI of a specific workload is proportional to the execution time of this workload, amortized over the device lifetime and all the devices involved in this workload. For example, take a look at a CPU. The TSMC reports 39.5 tons of SO2 emission in 2021, and this translates into this much of SO2 per production unit or per wafer mask layer. And this in turn based on the die size, the technology node, and yield of a specific CPU. This translates into this amount of SO2 per EPIC 7743 produced. And this is equivalent to this amount of acidification potential, and it does not incur any eutrophication or freshwater ecotoxicity impact. And using the midpoint to endpoint conversion framework, this corresponds to this amount of species year loss. Although this may look minimal, when we repeat the process for other substances and aggregate the impact of all the CPUs made in each year, or all the components in the system, this can be actually non-negligible number. And more details can be found in the paper. As for OBI, it is rather simple. It counts the biodiversity damage incurred from generating the electricity needed for the operational use of computing devices. And just like the operational carbon, the task-specific OBI of a workload is proportional to its energy consumption. And it also depends on the regional grid emission factor. That is, where it is employed also matters. So using these tools, we evaluate across different devices, systems, workloads. We quantify the impact of 4 different CPUs, 5 different GPUs, and 3 types of different storage and memory devices. We quantify the impact of 3 different scale systems, from a local testbed server, which mimics a lab workstation, to a mid-size communique cluster, and finally to a petascale supercomputer. For the workloads, we select 7 different HPC workloads that covers a lot of different computing scenarios. And we aim to answer these research questions, which will be addressed later in detail. So the first question is that which life cycle stage contributes most to computing's biodiversity impact? We first analyze the impact breakdown into different life cycle stages and different impact categories. So the upper figure is the midpoint impact breakdown, where the x-axis is different devices arranged by their time coming into the market, and the y-axis is the impact scale. So in these figures, the key information is, first, the manufacturing overwhelmingly dominates the embodied impact. Second, the acidification is the single largest midpoint impact when we look by category. Last, although the absolute impact of these devices increases over time, when looking at a per T-flop impact, the newer, more efficient devices have a much more lower biodiversity impact on a performance basis. That was for the individual devices. Now we look at the system-level EBI, and the results show that the impact numbers grow almost linearly with the amount of devices in the system. But the EBI contribution breakdown among different components can be quite different depending on the system composition. For example, whether it is CPU heavy like Gauchi or GPU heavy like Permato. So system level EPI depends both on the system scale and the hardware composition. Then we do the lifecycle analysis for individual devices, assuming different system load and quantify the OBI. We use three levels of different three different load levels, ranging from 30% to 70%. At each level, the OBI is significantly larger than the EBI. And at 70% load, the OBI can be nearly 100 times higher than the annualized EBI for CPUs and GPU. So the takeaway is when we are using conservative estimation, Fab-to-Grave in our study scope, and the US grade average emission factor, the operational electricity dominates the life cycle biodiversity impact. That was for the individual devices impact per year. And when we look at the system level, it is roughly the same story. Take Permater as the example. From the previous calculation, we already know that the annualized EBI of Permater is roughly about this amount. And still, when we assume 70% load and US grade average emission factors, the Permater's annual OBI reaches almost 60 times that of annual EBI. And Permater ranks the 25th in the top 500 supercomputer list. If 400 Permater class systems are active globally, the total biodiversity impact is almost greater than one species a year, and this is non-negligible. Okay, for the second research question, how do the biodiversity impact vary across HPC workloads and system platforms? To answer this question, we experiment on three different platforms, two using GCP instances and one on the local testbed, representing a time-evolving trend of HPC systems every 2 to 3 years. The result in this figure, where the x-axis is different workload and y-axis are normalized throughput, energy consumption, and biodiversity impact, using the oldest 2019 CPU as the baseline. This gives us many insights. On the one hand, the newest 2023 CPU from GCP not only has better throughput and energy efficiency, but also half the biodiversity impact. On the other hand, despite the local CPU achieves overall better throughput and even comparable to that of the newest cloud CPU on some tasks, the biodiversity impact even doubled. This highlights the necessity of data center level power management and optimization. For the last question, how does the deployment location affect computing's biodiversity impacts? We pick 4 different regions, which are the Midwest region in the United States, the California grid, Taiwan, and Quebec. They have very much different regional energy mix, where the Midwest and Taiwan is fossil fuel heavy, and Quebec is hydro driven, and California also has a lot of renewables, including hydro and solar. And they also have different carbon emissions and SO2 and NOx emission factors. And this in turn finally drives into the reason why they have very much different biodiversity impact if we deploy Permater in these different regions. So the conclusion is that low carbon grids like US grade average and MISO, although they have lower carbon emission factors than that of Taiwan, it actually has higher biodiversity impact because the SO2 and NOx emission factors are higher in these two regions. And a hydro-based grid like Quebec can actually cut the operational impact by 2 orders of magnitude to even smaller than that of the EBI, which highlights the necessity of devotion into the renewable investment. So the takeaway is that focusing solely on SCO2 is not enough to achieve sustainable of computing. Strict SO2 and NOx limits and renewable highway grids can also greatly cut the total biodiversity impact. So this highlights the need for pollution-specific policies. To conclude, in this study, we first identify the research gap or blank in the biodiversity loss induced by computing activities. Then we introduced Fabric, EBI, and OBI to connect the workloads to the biodiversity loss numbers. And finally, there are some take-home messages. The first one is, by life cycle stages, manufacturing dominates EBI. And by the impact categories, acidification dominates EBI. And for the life cycle analysis, when assuming the conservative Fab-to-Grave scope and US grade average emission factors, OBI dominates the life cycle impact. Finally, strict emission standards and renewable highway grids are two promising paths for us to achieve a more sustainable computing. This is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take any additional questions. Thank you.